So with a video like this, you really have to capture people's attention in the first 30 seconds or so. Because you just clicked on this video, you probably have at least a passing interest in jazz. Because it's a pretty interesting topic, and there's a lot that I think will surprise you if you don't know a lot about jazz fusion. Basically, jazz fusion is a subgenre of jazz that takes on aspects of other genres, like rock and roll. It also has a more kind of electronic disposition. More traditional forms of jazz usually include a lot more acoustic instruments, like an upright bass, a double bass, horns with trumpets, trombones, saxophones. But with jazz fusion, you're hearing synths, you're hearing electric guitars, electric bass, a lot more effects, even like experimental electronic woodwinds. You also see an expansion of the drum kit, right? Because a jazz kit is very simple. A jazz fusion kit has a lot more auxiliary percussion, a la rock and roll or Latin music. I hate saying Latin music because it's like it's its own massive world of music, but you get the idea. The drums are more complicated in jazz fusion, sometimes like an insane amount. That's what you could have found on Google, but things are more complicated than that. Jazz fusion was born into conflict. It's controversial, hated even by some, including some really major figures in the jazz world. But jazz fusion also has this stickiness to it, this infectiousness. It really kind of spread like a wave throughout the world. There were scenes popping up everywhere, from New York to Johannesburg to Tokyo. And that's the thing, once it took off, jazz fusion was kind of unstoppable. It was bringing a lot of people into the jazz tradition that really weren't jazz listeners beforehand, which is cool. But it was also railing against the sometimes strict rules of what a jazz group should be, or really what jazz music should be. And many formerly traditional jazz artists couldn't resist the temptation that fusion provided. More toys, more sounds to choose from, and maybe more importantly, a life preserver, a possibility of renewing a waning cultural relevancy. The question for some seemed like writing on the wall. Do you want to join the future, or do you want to slowly decay as part of a legacy genre? Of course, this is not my view of subgenres of jazz that existed before fusion, but also the pace of musical change, I think really beginning in the late 60s, continuing through the 70s and into the 80s, it must have felt like a hurricane. Anyway, I'm David Hughes, this is Charcuterie Sound, and today we're going to be having a quick chat about jazz fusion. And as always, if you stick around to the end of the video, I have some great recommendations that can help you out if you're trying to get into jazz fusion as a listener. So let's get into it. So it's worth mentioning that some jazz fusion can be a little challenging for the uninitiated if you're not a jazz fan or if you don't really listen to jazz very often. But luckily, I have a video for beginners to jazz that should really kind of teach you the language of the genre so that you can kind of understand what's going on. I'll put a link in the description to that video. That being said, you can also just watch this video on its own. Please do. And of course, if you like topics like this, or you're just curious about diving a little bit deeper into your musical journey, please consider liking or subscribing. It really helps me out, and I really appreciate it. I'm terrible at self-promotion, if you couldn't tell. So let's get back to jazz fusion, which, if we're to understand it well, we really do need a heaping dose of context, which really sets us up to answer the question, what caused this tectonic shift in jazz? And why should the average music listener care? Now, before we get too stuck in, I think it's really important to remember that in the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s, jazz was the mainstream in American music. This was popular music for a diverse audience. It was party music, it was dance music, but it was pop music. It included sappy vocal ballads for the heartbroken, the scores to countless movies and musicals. But for every mainstream genre, there's often a mirrored underground version, and that is definitely the case with jazz. And this type of jazz really started developing in the late 40s. It focused more on technical innovation and improvisation, and it was kind of opposed to the orchestral grandiosity of earlier traditions. And yes, I'm aware of the underground jazz scene, which was developing in the 1920s in Chicago, but this was more of a hyper-localized exception than the rule. This scene also included a young Louis Armstrong, which is also really cool. But it would be this intellectualized, more improvisational jazz that kind of forms our cultural image of the genre. What you think about when you hear the word jazz. You know, longer solos, blue notes, smoky cocktail bar. In these mental images, it's usually a quartet or a trio. These are not the swinging orchestras of previous decades. There's something more intimate here. And this is the jazz of legends like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, Oscar Peterson. Now, I don't mean to make it seem like this was like deep underground music that nobody was aware of. That's not the case. But it did start to cleave away from the mainstream, especially with the diversification of genres that was happening in the 50s and the 60s. And this is especially true in the mid to late 60s when we're hearing a lot more avant-garde jazz. What I often hear as a counter to this is that jazz was actually having its most popular cultural moment, as proven by the success of the album Kind of Blue, which is often touted as the best-selling jazz album of all time. So how can it be possible that jazz as a cultural institution was on the retreat, but also Kind of Blue sold so well? These two things seem to be kind of a cognitive dissonance. It doesn't make any sense. Now, there's a few reasons for this, but I'm not going to get too bogged down in it because this video is supposed to be about jazz fusion. And, well, I just want to get ahead of this because I can already see the comment. Basically, improved recording, manufacturing, and the costs associated with manufacturing records was getting a lot better. It was getting a lot more affordable. So there was really an explosion of music purchase for home consumption across all genres. There was just a lot more music sold, and a lot more people had the ability to play music at home. And this also lines up exactly with the post-war economic boom. People had more disposable income to spend on things like music. And another reason why Kind of Blue did so well was hipsters, really. That, and it's actually not that challenging of a record to listen to. It's very different, but it just doesn't have the same challenge level as Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come or something like that. But yes, Kind of Blue was incredibly successful, and jazz was also becoming slowly but surely less relevant. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And to be entirely transparent, this is actually one of my favorite eras in jazz history, the 10 or so years before jazz fusion would emerge. Musically, artists were taking a lot of risks in this era, playing with music theory in ways that hadn't been done before, testing long-held best practices. And there was also kind of a changing view on the role of music, what music could be artistically. And this became what jazz meant. Experimentation, improvisation, challenge to the starchy rules of Western musical harmony. And this way of looking at jazz, this was the incubator that allowed jazz fusion to happen. So when new technologies made even further experimentation possible, a lot of artists jumped at the chance to do that. It just didn't seem like an overly large gulf to bridge for a lot of established artists. It was just jazz. It was just moving forward the way that jazz does. Of course, there are also holdouts, people who thought that making this type of jazz was tantamount to abandoning the entire jazz tradition wholesale. But this cultural moment, this is the beginning of jazz fusion. Now, where exactly that begins is a point of debate. But I think 1967 is really when the idea of fusion as a genre began to solidify. And this is largely thanks to artists like Larry Coryell and Gary Burton with their quartet's album Duster. And yeah, this is great. You hear jazz and rock coming together, but there are also a lot of aspects that we think of when we think of jazz fusion that are still missing. We don't have any far-out electronic effects, synths, influences from funk. For that, you really have to wait for Miles Davis to grab onto this fledgling genre and take it to new places. You need Herbie Hancock to show just how groovy and funky jazz can be, without, of course, losing its soul. And what's really neat is that these legends were playing more traditional forms of jazz pre-1967, and they adopted these technologies and techniques with very little friction. Another interesting thing is at the same time jazz was taking on aspects of rock and roll, rock was also borrowing from jazz. The messy and bizarre guitar intro to the Byrds' psychedelic classic 8 Miles High was influenced by the improvisational solos of John Coltrane. Not to mention progressive rock, which I just did a video on, I'll put a link in the description, which is a more experimental and genre-bending flavor of rock and roll. It was just beginning to form out of the psychedelic scene, and it was directly incorporating ideas from jazz, including long stretches of improvisation, atonality, and more complex harmonies. So jazz fusion is controversial, even today, for many jazz listeners. And notice how I say listeners. It's usually less of a problem among musicians who may stick to a more traditional form of jazz, but don't have an issue with the idea of playing jazz with electric instruments or taking in other influences. Seems to me to be mostly a listener thing or a fan thing. But I find it fascinating that this particular schism in jazz, and there have been several, has caused such a stir. It may be the kind of like biggest conflict point in the history of jazz. Maybe free jazz or avant-garde jazz, but I think it's fusion, to be honest, unless you count smooth jazz as jazz. But I know that there are a few reasons that people don't like jazz fusion, ranging from the totally understandable, it's just not my preference, to, things that are a little bit more silly, like it's not even jazz. But I think perhaps the silliest reason for not liking jazz fusion is just a confusion of terms. And to talk about that, I have to talk about the elephant in the room, the elephant in every room where jazz is appreciated, and that is smooth jazz. I have to talk about it, but please stay with me. I'm not a zealot for or against. Hear me out. Now, smooth jazz definitely has its roots, at least some of them, in jazz fusion, largely because it makes use of electronic instruments, but it's entirely its own beast. This is the genre with artists like Kenny G, Chuck Mangione, Dave Koz, and among a lot of jazz heads, this stuff is kryptonite. My own personal opinion is that while this is not my favorite style of music by a long shot, there are some good hidden gems there. It's not all bad. And there is some, just self-indulgent guilty pleasure cheese in there too, which is okay. That's totally fine. Like, I remember years ago reading an article in Esquire, and I'll throw it up on the screen if I can find it, or it's not behind a paywall or something like that. Even a music writer for an established publication like Esquire was really confusing these two terms, jazz fusion and smooth jazz. How I learned to love jazz fusion, the worst genre ever, or something like that. And to be honest, the author did clear up that he wasn't talking about the early efforts of Miles Davis or, like Weather Report or something like that. He was talking about Kenny G and those kind of artists. But then he continued to use the term jazz fusion for all of the smooth jazz that he had, come to like ironically or something like that. I get it. I'm pretty loosey-goosey with genre terms. I think they're fluid and flexible and overlapping, and that's okay, but this is playing pretty fast and loose. Whether you believe in a socially constructed definition of genre, or you're just using it like taxonomically, how we group like music, even if you're doing either of those things, this is a little sloppy, right, to use this interchangeably. I think it might be a bit purposely inflammatory. It got me to read the article, and I get it. I'm making videos for YouTube. You have to have a title that's catchy, or it just gets drowned out. Unfortunately, this is kind of dripped into the cultural milieu, and now people kind of conflate the two terms, which is frustrating because they're very different genres of jazz. They're very different subgenres. Yeah. Now, jazz fusion may not be for everybody, but you're definitely not going to hear Bitches Brew by Miles Davis on your local smooth jazz radio station. It's just not going to happen. They're different types of music. Now, for others, jazz fusion is unlikable for the same reason that avant-garde jazz might be unlikable or free jazz. It's just too experimental. It's not easy to listen to sometimes. And that's okay. A lot of jazz fusion rejects traditional tonality, brings in new crazy sounds that not everybody is used to and not everybody likes. It's like hot sauce, you know? Some people can't handle any heat and other people want to chemically dissolve their tongue, it seems. Another complaint that you might hear as well is that some of the electronic sounds from these albums, they haven't aged well. What probably at one time seemed like a futuristic novelty now sounds a little naive and cheesy, I guess. Not my view. I love this stuff. It's a chapter in musical history. Like, what's not to love? Again, none of these are complaints I have with jazz fusion. This is just what I do. I go onto Reddit, I go onto forums, and I try and get people's take on genres as they exist today. Also do a lot of archival reading, magazines, newspapers, trying to find music reviews, so I can also see how people viewed a genre as it was developing. And I take all this information and I distill it for you guys, and for some reason that's my idea of a good time. Apologies for that departure. We're going to go back to the story now. And I'd really like to call out a scene that deserves it more than most, that I think is really at the highest level of the jazz fusion hierarchy. It's really good, and it's Japanese jazz fusion. Definitely one of my favorite international fusion scenes. If you haven't checked it out, it is crazy and it's a bottomless pit. There's a lot there. The fusion scene that developed in Yokohama and Tokyo in the 1970s and 80s is some of the most exciting, funky, just fun jazz that you're likely to hear anywhere. This is partly because Japan was and still is a manufacturer of some of the best electronic music gear that you can buy, and it's no surprise that these exciting technologies were adopted by an already vibrant jazz scene that was existing in Japan at that time. And that's something we have to get straight, that there was already a thriving jazz scene especially in Yokohama in the 60s and even earlier. And I think if there's one band that you really have to check out from the scene, it's Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia. I'm going to say Cassiopeia because that's what I've heard people saying. These guys are absolutely fantastic, and it's not overly challenging if you're new to jazz or you don't like more experimental jazz, but that doesn't mean it's any less incredible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get into some proper recommendations. So here we have it, 6 different albums by 6 fantastic jazz fusion artists. And first off, we have Bitches Brew by Miles Davis. Now, I usually don't start off with an album that's this challenging for the uninitiated, so if you can't get into this, maybe first check out the recommendations on my Jazz for Beginners video. Also, there are more traditionally melodic things coming your way, so don't stress too much. But if you've already got jazz running through your veins, check out the track Pharaoh's Dance for some chaotic funk insanity. And for our second recommendation, we have Heavy Weather by Weather Report. This is one of my all-time favorite jazz albums, period, and I think it's Weather Report's best work. It's just a ridiculous amount of fun. And listening to Jaco Pastorius on bass is always a great reminder to put my bass guitar back in its case and never try to play the instrument again. Next up, we have Duster by the Gary Burton Quartet. And while this is an extremely solid album, this is here more as a historical signpost. This is one of the very first real fusion albums, and you can see, especially after listening to Heavy Weather, how quickly this genre would develop. For our fourth recommendation, we have Flying Beagle by Himiko Kikuchi. Here's our first Japanese record so far. And this album is living proof that an album cover can be as charming as the music inside. It's funky, it's fun, and it's an extremely easy listen. And next up, we have the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Birds of Fire. Now this is definitely the most jazz rock record so far, so get ready for some incredible shredding, as well as some acoustic virtuosity. Now people seem to either love or hate this group, and I definitely fall into the former category. Give it a listen, see what you think. And for our final recommendation today, we're heading back to Japan with Mint Jams by Cassiopeia. This is just another incredible Japanese fusion effort, and it's a really funky finish for our list. Check out Time Limit for some crazy gooey bass lines and Mario Kart-esque synth solos. So there you have it, some great fusion records to get you started. You may have noticed a distinct lack of more contemporary fusion. That's by design. I really hope to do a part 2. eventually. So we'll see what the rest of the year has in store. Anyway, that's it for today. I really hope you check out some of those recommendations. And if you liked this video, please subscribe. That would really help me out, and I'd really appreciate it. And as always, stay curious, keep listening, and I'll see you next time.